morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, January 13th, 2021. And these days, if you're like me, we're hearing more and more people, primarily on the right, claim that the greatest threat to liberty are companies kicking people off their platforms, deplatforming them, not giving them a space for speech. And I'm going to highlight a few examples of that I think are pretty prominent, not just from very recently, but from a couple of years ago as well. I've got another one that isn't on that topic too, but I think you'll find it pretty interesting. But I want to take what we're hearing is the greatest threat to liberty today and compare it with what the founders, with a number of leading founders, I've got somewhere between 7 and 10 different founders, about 10 to 12 quotes, talking about what they considered to be the greatest threat to liberty. Now, we often hear from people that oppose our work that, oh, the founders did not speak as with one voice. And I often try to find collections of quotes that fit a very specific topic where they all looked at things pretty much the same. But today I'm going to show you how different founders had different views on what the greatest threat to liberty was. And we can compare it with what we're hearing the greatest threat to liberty is today. And then I'm going to go back and actually address the deplatforming issue. I've got some information or a great quote from Benjamin Franklin on the freedom of speech, but I want to highlight an example of his that he went through early on in his life. And I also want to give an example from the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention on deplatforming, which I think most people don't even know about. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. All the archives for over 2.5 years. On individual episodes, I link to all the stuff that I'm talking about because I'm just citing small quotes so you can see the tweets today. I've got articles, I've got original source documents, all kinds of interesting stuff so you can read and learn more on your own time. You can find all the platforms we're on. And since we're talking about deplatforming, let me list them because the more times we all hear them and talk about them, the more that we're going to be readily available to jump to another platform when the 10th Amendment Center eventually gets booted from your favorite one. So of course we're on all the mainstream ones, and we will continue to do that as long as we are able to reach and teach people who are out there. We're on Facebook, DLive, Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube for live streaming. Archive, my favorite platform is library.tv or odyssey.com. Same platform. That is a decentralized, censorship-resistant platform. You really need to follow us there if you want to make sure that our videos never go away. That's the place to be. We're also on brighteon.com, BitChute, and bittube.tv. The podcast edition is over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Podbean, all the main ones. You can find all that and more, including our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, easy peasy, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat and give everyone a few more moments to get notifications to join us on the live stream. Bob Landry, good to see you. Funky Euphemism, as always, from up in the Twin Cities. I'm sure it's warm there these days. Wow. Patricia Dance in Syracuse, Tim Martin, Casa Grande, Dixie Strong in Alabama. Patricia has a great comment here. She says, is the greatest threat ignorance? And I'll get to some views from Jefferson later, but Thomas Jefferson, he didn't call it the greatest threat, but he specifically said at one point, and I don't have the exact citation, but he said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. So it's a big one. I appreciate you mentioning that. Yo to Dan Reed, Melody Skaman, sup to MRGF, Lawrence Smith from cold but sunny West Virginia. I bet it's beautiful out there. Clay Davis, good morning to you as well. Justin Morrison, Grant Sunberg, man, good to see you, buddy. Shane Brish, I apologize if I get your name wrong, pronounced wrong. Good morning from Texas. And everybody else. I apologize if I miss anybody. There's Tim Martin, Steve Wyatt, and Jim Knowlton. Good to see you, man. So let's get right to this. I want to start out with some of the examples that I've been seeing. I've been seeing a kind of a consistent messaging from more conservative circles about what the most dangerous thing that we face. Now, I started this organization in 2006 at the height of the Bush administration. So it was funny when the Obama people were in power, we would always get attacked. Well, where were you saying this stuff about the Constitution when Bush was around? Well, we were right here doing the exact same thing. We're going to have that no matter what team is in power in Washington, D.C., they always complain. But we put out the same type of message no matter who's in charge in Washington, D.C., because it's not about party. It's not about team. It's not about individual. It's about principles for the Constitution and liberty, no matter which team is in charge. We have to this is the largest government in the history of the world. It doesn't matter who's running it. They all suck. They're all evil monsters. We have to reject and resist and nullify them no matter what. But in recent years, I've seen very consistent things coming from the right. Now, when Bush was in office, we were always told that the greatest threat to everything was the terrorists. And if you weren't for unconstitutional, undeclared wars, you obviously hated America and you hated the terrorists. We got attacked viciously for that over and over and over, for opposing the Patriot Act or the Real ID Act, surveillance, for opposing unconstitutional, undeclared wars and the like. Anyway, so Dan Bongino, we all know that guy's name, right? Dan puts it this way. This was just a few days ago. In a tweet, he says, "This will be my final post on this anti-American platform. The greatest threats to liberty are the destructive tech tyrants who have acted as publishers in their ongoing wars on conservatives and free speech." You can find me on Parler, where we respect free speech. I'm D. Bongino. So he looks at the greatest threats, or the greatest threat to liberty. I'm not sure if it should be, I guess, plural, because there's multiple tech tyrants, and a lot of those people have no views that are close to mine. I agree with that, certainly. But the greatest threats to liberty are the technology tyrants who don't allow him or others a platform to speak. Now, this is not new. A few years before that, I've seen this ramp up for a while. Here at PragerU, citing Brent Bozell from Newsbusters, I believe, conservative group, big tech censorship is the greatest threat to liberty in history. The greatest threat to liberty in history. Now, I'm not saying that you should just ignore this, but the notion that it's the greatest threat to liberty in history, I've been digging through the founders for quite a while. I've never seen something like that from them. And I just want to put a comparison out there so you guys get an idea of where I'm going. Here's another one that's along the same lines, but I think it's also missing the point. Mark Levin. Here's a guy that you should know that I do not like. The greatest threat to our Constitution and economic system isn't any foreign power. It's the Democratic Party. It's the leftists in the Democratic Party, because they use our liberty and our Constitution to destroy our liberty and our Constitution. So what we hear from these circles is it's either the tech tyrants or the opposing party. So therefore, the end result is an encouragement to vote for another party or support another party to stop those evil leftists, of course. So really, this messaging ends up being politicking in support of one party or another. We know what happens when you support factions. George Washington, in his famous farewell address, he warned us that supporting one faction over the other, attacking one or another, is in itself a great evil. It's a despotism. So let's go forward a little bit, and I want to compare this with a view of some of the founders. First, start out with Patrick Henry. Does he talk about deplatforming or publishing? We've got examples that I'll get to in a few minutes. But Patrick Henry thought the greatest threat, or the greatest of evils, was this: a consolidation. He says, they, sir, this is in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June 7th, 1788. He says, they, sir, avoided a consolidation as the greatest of evils. Consolidation, centralization of power, to Patrick Henry, was the greatest threat, the greatest evil that we face. Here again, also in that same speech of June 7th, 1788, he hammered it home. He didn't want to just point it out once. He says, dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed. So he's acknowledging that it's not just the greatest danger we have to worry about. There are many dangers, and maybe the big tech companies are a serious problem. I'm not going to have that debate right now, but I want to compare to the view that it's the greatest threat that we face. Patrick Henry certainly looked at something else, and he recognized that there are many dangers in how you proceed. He says, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive. I don't know why this is not shifting here. Is it not shifting as I pull it up on the screen? Well, if not, Then I just won't have it. It'll just be my ugly mug up on the screen. But Patrick Henry says, dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive. He was not alone on this idea of consolidation. Here's Richard Henry Lee. This was 14th of September in 1789 when he was in Congress. He says, the most essential danger from the present system arises from its tendency to a consolidated government. So again, consolidation was a huge problem for these leading Virginians, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee as well. We also have Thomas Jefferson. Let me see if I can get this to actually work up on the screen here. No, we're still seeing Dan Bongino for some reason. I'm going to try to adjust this real quick. My apologies. Application. Here we go. There's Jefferson. We can see him up on the screen now. Hopefully it'll switch as I keep going through this. Jefferson says this way, and this was in a letter to William Johnson on March 4th, 1823. There is no danger, according to Thomas Jefferson, the guy who is the primary drafter of the Declaration of Independence. I think he holds a little bit of weight in our view of liberty. Here's how Jefferson put it. There is no danger I apprehend so much as the consolidation of our government. Again, just like Patrick Henry, and at least for a while, Richard Henry Lee, Richard Henry Lee at another time recognized that paper money or the form of currency was the greatest threat to liberty at that particular time. So Richard Henry Lee kind of changed his mind and saw various things, and I think other people can as well. But Jefferson said consolidation of power, again, like Richard Henry Lee, like Patrick Henry. And how? He says, by the noiseless and therefore unalarming instrumentality of the Supreme Court. And Jefferson has, and so does Patrick Henry, a couple of centuries of being proven right. We see that liberty is under attack all around us, and it has coincided with the consolidation of power, as Jefferson warned, through the Supreme Court. The central government has more and more power, and our liberty is less and less. We were warned, and they were obviously prophetic when it came. Maybe they were just smart. They studied history, and they recognized that consolidation was a huge problem. Now, here's another example. John Adams. It wasn't just Virginians. It wasn't just anti-Federalists. And Jefferson absolutely was not an anti-Federalist. He specifically said, no, I'm not a Federalist or an anti-Federalist. I find myself closer to the Federalists, but I'm definitely not either. Here's John Adams, very much a Federalist. He put it this way in October of 1780. There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties. Now, if you compare that with the fake constitutionalist Mark Levin, who I can't stand again, if you guys want to ask me about that, tweet at me at Michael Bolden. Mark Levin is just awful in my view. He, Sean Hannity, and a lot of these other people who pretend to stand on the Constitution, but when it doesn't fit their political narrative, just throw it in the trash. That's what we get all the time, especially when it comes to the powers of war. But he says it's one party over the other is the problem. So he's actually playing into what John Adams had to say, which was there's nothing that he dreaded so much as the division of the Republic into two great parties. So people like Levin and others are actually doing what John Adams warned us against. Now, I saw Funky Euphemism make a comment about this a little bit earlier, but he was right on point with James Madison's view. James Madison put it this way in the Philadelphia Convention, August 23rd, 1787, he says, as the greatest danger to liberty, the greatest danger to liberty, according to the father of the Constitution, again, if it's the father of the Constitution, James Madison's view versus any political pundit today, including myself, I think I'm just going to go with James Madison because he knows more about history than any of us. So Madison put it this way, as the greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies, it is best to prevent them by an effectual provision for a good militia. I got to repeat that. As the greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies, it is best to prevent them by an effectual provision for a good militia. I've covered this in other episodes, but this is a twofer here. Madison is against the massive military empire that we live under today, the large standing army, largest in history, larger than the next 7 to 10 countries combined in spending. But at the same time, he's very much in support of militia, and maybe it's a threefer, the right to keep and bear arms. This is why the founders over and over wanted average people to be able to have military-grade weapons. because without them, the excuses for having professional large standing armies would really be hard to reject. So this is how you prevent having them, allowing the people to be able to defend their country without having to rely on that large standing army, because James Madison himself said it was incredibly dangerous. Now, he was not alone. Here's Elbridge Gerry. This is he was in Congress at this point from Massachusetts, August 20th, 1789. He reaffirms this same type of a principle. He says, "What, sir, is the use of a militia? It is to prevent the establishment of a standing army, the bane of liberty." So that's Elbridge Gerry. And then, of course, we have an anti-federalist. If we want to balance it all out here, here's Democratic Federalist. We don't know who actually wrote this one, but it was October 17th, 1787, just after the Philadelphia Convention convened or finished up. He says, "The experience of past ages and the result of the inquiries of the best and most celebrated patriots have taught us to dread a standing army above all earthly evils." So we've got Federalist James Madison, Elbridge Gerry, who was kind of back and forth. He was for and against. He was against, and then he ended up coming around for, and then he served in Congress. And then we have staunch anti-federalist, a Democratic Federalist, all saying standing armies were something to dread, as in this case, above all earthly evils. Now, this is a totally different topic here, but this is from a guy named Reverend Isaac Bacchus. I only learned about him recently. He was one of the leading orators during the American Revolution. He was a Baptist minister. They call him, he was one of the leaders of the pulpit of the American Revolution, if you want to look that up in history. Here he is in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, I believe it was February of 1788. He says, "And let the history of all nations be searched from that day to this, and it will appear that the imposing of religious tests hath been the greatest engine of tyranny in the world." So religious tests on people to be able to serve in office or to be able to serve in government or work in government, whatever term, he thought that that was the greatest engine of tyranny. Of course, it doesn't say something about platforming or deplatforming. Here's Thomas Paine. He says the evils of paper money, I don't know if he called it the number one, but he says the evils of paper money have no end. And at another time, as I mentioned earlier, Richard Henry Lee says the greatest problem that we face in our current circumstances was the state of our currency because of paper. So this would be a great argument for ending the Fed. If we're following Thomas Paine, Richard Henry Lee, and others, we could say, you know what, the Federal Reserve is the greatest threat to liberty. If we're following James Madison, we're saying, well, we got to cut back on this massive military, not always expand it. Anytime they reduce even the increase of spending, we hear from the hawks and the neocons and the neoliberals or whatever the hell they want to call themselves, they're telling us that we're attacking America and we're gutting the military. Well, James Madison was for gutting the military. Thomas Jefferson, when he came in office in 1800, absolutely reduced the size of the military as well. So the evils of paper money have no end. Now let's talk a little bit about the concept of deplatforming and free speech. And we can go back to Benjamin Franklin, who did some of the best writing on this. He was born, I think, in 1705, something like that. He was really old school. So here he is. I think he was maybe 30 or 31 years old in 1737 when he wrote this. On freedom of speech and the press. This was published in the Pennsylvania Gazette. He says, when freedom of speech is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved and tyranny is erected on its ruins. So when we can't share our views, when we can't have freedom of speech, when we're criminalized, for example, for saying things that are not acceptable, or not allowed, whatever it may be, this is the beginning of a destruction of a free society. Now, this has been happening in this country for a very, very long time. Now, it would be very easy to say, oh, okay, well, I can see if you take Benjamin Franklin's quote isolated, and then you apply to what Bongino had to say, then absolutely, he's right. Like, look, he's just following what Benjamin Franklin has to say. But is that really what Benjamin Franklin is doing? And I want to share an example of himself a few years earlier. When he was very young, he tried hard to get things published in his brother's newspaper. And I apologize that this is not showing up properly on the screen, but Benjamin Franklin, you may know, published a bunch of stuff under the pen name Silence Dogood. As a woman, I guess Benjamin Franklin was one of the first trans out there. Mrs. Silence Dogood was the pen name used by Benjamin Franklin to get his work published in the New England Courant, a newspaper founded and published by his brother James Franklin. He was not allowed by his own brother to get his stuff published. I don't know the full story. Other people probably know this way better than me who have actually studied that. But he tried for quite a while submitting stuff to his brother's paper to get it published, and he kept getting rejected. And I have a funny feeling it was like, dude, you're like 17 years old, 16 years old. You know, this may be great, and I encourage you to do more, but this is not, we're not going to run this. You have no respect in the community. This would probably look bad. I'm going to run my brother's stuff, and he's just a kid. I think that's kind of how it played out, because as soon as he changed and started submitting things to Mrs. Silence Dogood, then they started publishing because the principles in there were really strong. The first one were published in 1722, and I think he was 16, 17 years old at that point. And I think the message here is that when we're talking about freedom of speech, Benjamin Franklin isn't talking about the fact that a platform, a publisher, did not allow him to find a way to publish his stuff. That's not what Benjamin Franklin was talking about, because in his own experience, he didn't run to the government to try to force his brother to allow him to actually get it published. He found a creative way to do it. And maybe he didn't reach as many people as he wanted to, but he certainly still had the freedom of speech. It was up to the business to allow him or not. And we don't see in the history of this, we don't see anything from Benjamin Franklin running to government to try to force it to happen. Another example I want to share on this comes from the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. I've talked about it briefly before, but I think it's important to remind us that deplatforming and the cancel culture is not new. This was actually very popular in the age of the founding. And here, from an article by Gordon Wood, a great historian, covering another great historian who passed away, Pauline Maier, her book Ratification, which is one of my favorites. If you want to read something that's actually kind of written in a storytelling way, it's the book Ratification by Pauline Maier. She goes through the ratification process state by state by state, and you learn how it all played out. And it's not just told in a dry history way, it's just an interesting narrative tale. But here from Gordon Wood's review of hers in The New Republic some years ago, he put it this way: in Pennsylvania, the supporters of the Constitution, the Federalists, as they called themselves, and I like that he said that because they called themselves Federalists, they sensed that time was not on their side and attempted to rush the process of ratification using ham-handed techniques to prevent critics of the Constitution from being heard. So they were very concerned. They really wanted to rush and get things moving along with Delaware, get things ratified, because they knew there was strong opposition. We learn, of course, years later, there was still opposition to the new Constitution in what became, or what we learned to be known as the Whiskey Rebellion. I covered that elsewhere last year. I wish I had a link to that, but I'll see if I can dig one up and include it in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So they were concerned that they were going to lose. It was a very close thing that happened, that whole ratification thing. And even though there were enough states, in most of those states, it was just do or die. Places like New York, in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, in Virginia, and elsewhere. But so Gordon Wood, citing Pauline Maier, talks about how in Pennsylvania, they knew this was a problem. So they just tried to slam it through. And what did they do? He writes, the initial publication of the debates in the state ratifying convention printed only the speeches of the Federalists, as if there were no opposition whatsoever. The anti-Federalists, and as I read through this again, I read through this article again this morning for like the 5th time, I'm reminded that anti-Federalist was a term of art. It was a propaganda term. Anti-Federalists actually saw themselves as supporting more federalism, and they saw the advocates of the Constitution, the Federalists, as being in support of more consolidation and dangerous. So these were kind of propaganda terms, and when we use those terms that they used, were actually telling history from the view of the victors, and it's not really a true, honest story. Anyways, so there was deplatforming that happened during the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, the Pennsylvania ratification debates. The general public, they didn't even have access to what the Anti-Federalists were saying was the problem with the Constitution. So people just had to maybe post bills outside on buildings or hand out leaflets. It's expensive to print stuff, of course. Going further, Wood writes, when another editor began printing a fuller record of the opposition's speeches, the Federalists pressured the owner of the paper to fire him. Doesn't that sound familiar? So the paper, a paper that was relatively friendly to the Federalists, was like, oh, you know what, we should really publish both sides because this is a problem. Let's just have some free speech and share it and let the people read it, and the people can learn on their own. And when they did that, there was cancel culture that came in. The pro-Constitution Federalists, cancel culture came in. They rained down on this publisher and just threatened them. If you continue doing this, you will be fired. So they stopped publishing. And Gordon writes again, he says, it's amazing that we have any record at all of what the critics of the Constitution said in Pennsylvania specifically. The Federalist victory in Pennsylvania was so crudely achieved that it endangered ratification elsewhere. And if you go through that entire history, even though we don't have tons of records, what we do have is a total lack of any record showing that anyone on the anti-Federalist side, the opposing side, we can call them, the people who opposed ratification, going to the government saying, you got to force these papers to allow us to publish. What the supporters of the Constitution actually learned was this is actually a bad idea. Deplatforming people is stupid. It may have short-term effects in support of their cause, and I think that will happen in current times, but over time, in the long run, it really is a very dangerous game for their own power. Now, the Federalists actually recognize this. And he goes on further, Gordon Wood writing here, he says, with her chronological narrative, Pauline Maier shows how the experience of one convention influenced the later ones. The supporters of the Constitution in Massachusetts were determined to avoid the clumsiness of the Pennsylvania Federalists. In fact, they totally rejected the idea of using this approach, this cancel culture, this deplatforming approach, because they thought it would actually ruin their chances for victory. And the reason is that victory was so close. I think these days there are way too many people who are okay with not getting information. We get so much of it. I don't really know, to be honest with you. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to deplatforming and freedom of speech, the founders were concerned with government actions. Now, they may not like the publishing or lack of publishing of private businesses, but they dealt with private businesses in a different way than we do today. And then, of course, we also have to reiterate that the greatest threat to liberty, even if deplatforming is a big problem, and you think it is a huge problem, there's no way that it is a greater problem than the largest government on the face of the earth. That is the most dangerous institution in world history, is the U.S. federal government. It spies on everyone. It does gun control every single day. It spends us into oblivion. We have a national debt in the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. I think it's like, if you count the unfunded part of it, it's like 180, maybe 200 trillion. It's nuts how much they're taking us to a fiscal cliff. And of course, the military empire, if we're talking about people like James Madison, Elbridge Gerry. Of course, Samuel Adams told us that standing armies always are dangerous to liberty. Then we have a different perspective on what the greatest threat is. That makes me think of Patrick Henry. I want to pull this one more quote up, and I think you'll find it interesting. And he put it this way: liberty, the greatest of all earthly blessings. Give us that precious jewel, and you may take everything else. Well, I'm going to take a quick look over in the live chat and see if there's any feedback or insight. Funky euphemism, it looks like it's talking about somebody with Section 230. MRGF says social media platforms are not supposed to be acting as publishers. Oh, that's the debate over there. I think Electronic Frontier Foundation has some interesting insight on that. And whether you think that they should not be doing this or should be, the fact of the matter is, are they the greatest threat to liberty? Not according to the founders. The founders didn't think of it this way. And of course, the founders also dealt with deplatforming during the ratification of the Constitution. And if we follow their example, we take a different approach than trying to use government. We don't want to use the largest government in the history to protect us, because the more power you give them today to protect you from some company, Just be creative and think how they could use that in the future. How will the current or the next president use that type of power? The last thing we want is more consolidation, more centralization of power. That's why I encourage people to use other platforms when they don't like the way that a business is acting. I think of it this way. If I go to a restaurant and they treat me like garbage, and it happens once in a while. I mean, surprise, surprise, right? Every once in a while, I'll get treated poorly. I have really bad service, get blown off, they don't bring you your stuff, they forget about you. If you have an experience like that, do you go back to the same restaurant? I know I have. It usually doesn't happen, but in general, I don't. So if they treat you poorly, why would you give them your business? And now in social media, for example, in the internet business, your data, your information, your activity, you are the product. You are not a customer. So why would you continue giving them the product if they don't respect you and they don't want you? Now, I know they don't respect me and they don't want me, but I'm setting that aside, my personal boundaries, my personal standards with most of the mainstream platforms. They don't like the type of stuff that I do. I'm certain of that. But I'm setting that aside because I'm using it as a tool to reach people that I probably would not be able to reach without them for the time being until I'm gone. But I do encourage you to check out other platforms. That's why we're on library.tv, odyssey.com, bittube.tv, brighteon.com, bitshoot.com, and then, of course, all the podcast platforms as well, dlive.com and things like that. Truth Free says liberal left talk shows are never as popular as conservative. I think there's so many people, there's so many of one and very few of the, well, there's a lot of both. Truth Free says government also wants fair time on talk radio. Taking a look, Leslie G, good to see you as well. Jim Knowlton says, very necessary episode. Thank you for doing it. Yeah, I think it's just important for us to compare what we think is so dangerous today. And I'm not saying that it isn't a problem, but I think if we're calling it the greatest threat to liberty, we're ignoring the fact that we live under the largest government in history. And it sounds really problematic because the greatest threat to liberty is, in fact, the government that's supposed to be following the Constitution, that is violating the liberty of people constantly, no matter which team is in charge in Washington, D.C. Anyways, I really appreciate watching this. I hope you found it interesting. I hope it made you at least think a little bit. I hope you learned something. Those stories about Benjamin Franklin writing as Silence Do Good, the story about the Philadelphia or the Pennsylvania ratifying convention and the deplatforming done by the Federalists to the Anti-Federalists, I think is very interesting. It's very insightful of maybe how we can start thinking about approaching this today. Let's not beg for access to the platforms that don't even like us. Let's find ways to support the people building other platforms so they can survive and thrive. And that's why I tell people, even though I don't like a lot of the content on gab.com, I find very little content there that I actually like when I go through there. And in fact, when I post as 10th Amendment Center there, there's very little interaction because I think the people that are there are not there for pro-Constitution content either. But we keep doing it. But I support the idea of what they're doing. Andrew Torba, who runs that, who probably, if I were to sit down with him, we'd find things to agree on. But I have a funny feeling, based on things that I've read, we find plenty to disagree on. But that doesn't mean I don't support his business model. And the business model is to build everything independently of the giant platforms. And if you really think about it even further, over the last 4 to 5 weeks, something like that, there has been approximately $500 million donated to efforts to stop a steal. And then we're told at the same time that conservatives don't have enough money or know-how to be able to fund a large infrastructure hosting company. I think that people are in the wrong direction. They're continually looking for ways to control the largest government in the history of the world rather than ways to escape it. With that, I hope you enjoyed the show. Please smash the like if you found it interesting and educational. Leave some comments. Send me an email at team@10thamendmentcenter.com if you've got questions or ideas for future shows. I get tons of them. Crazy Dave, who watches the show pretty regularly on YouTube. My example here is don't hold back because you think I might not like it. Dave sent me an idea that I told him, like, it's just not going to happen. We're not interested in that topic, but I appreciate it. And then other times We're going to get ideas for topics that I think are great or that I had never thought of. So just please continue doing that. I want to hear your thoughts, where I'm doing a good job, where I'm doing a crappy job, where I'm missing stuff, things that I should cover, and the like. And again, you can leave that in the comments on all the platforms. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And of course, if you want to support us financially, we can't get this work done without the financial faith of our members. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, where our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. Thanks again for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you have a good Wednesday, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.